Hey everyone, so as I'm sure you're probably aware, yesterday Bungie dropped an absolute nuclear bomb of a TWID featuring melee changes and armor exotic changes, and a lot of people are talking about the melee changes because they are accompanied by some pretty transformative sandbox shifts, which we're going to be talking about in this video. A lot of people have been asking me, yo Aegis, is grapple melee going to be better or worse next season? How much is consecration getting nerfed? Etc, etc. And so today, me and my friend, Spider Reviver, who is another excellent Destiny data scientist who tests a lot of stuff that's kind of not well known in the Destiny community. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, check him out. But me and him, he helped me proofread a ton of the numbers in this little slideshow that we're going to talk about in just a second. So shout out to him. He even helped me look at a couple things that I didn't even know about that were changing in the Edge of Fate. So big shout out to Spider Reviver, of course. If you guys just want to see the conclusions of this video, there's going to be a timestamp in the description or on your little, progress bar, where you can see the implications and my opinions as an endgame player of what is going to change in the sandbox as a result of these changes from this TWID. Assuming no other things change, which I'm sure other things are going to change and make parts of this video irrelevant, but we'll get there when we get there, right? So one more thing before we get started is that I wanted to talk about is, I have a slideshow now. A lot of you have said in the past that my videos are very podcast-like and you have them in the background, but some of you have said, they're not very visually appealing as like a main kind of focus thing on your main monitor, because I'm just like ranting on top of like a notepad text file, or I'm drawing in red marker on top of like a Bungie TWID. So I've been making presentations my whole life since I was a kid, and I like making them. So I was like, I'll just make a Google slide, and you guys let me know what you think. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. We'll see how it goes, but hopefully this is easier to digest for those of you who are going to be strapped in for the long content that we're going to be producing today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and click slideshow and let's get started. So a real quick outline again of what we're going to be talking about today. Number 1, melee changes. Number 2, neutral exotics. And then number 3, implications/conclusions. Now the melee changes are the bulk of this video. They're going to be split into 7 subsections. We're going to be talking about stacking, so like the multiplicative to additive change that I'm sure you've heard about, scaling, glaives, subclass buffs, exotic buffs, other buffs, and then finally the meat of this video, which is comparisons. Again, like I said in the intro, a lot of you have been asking me, is grapple melee on Hunter going to be better with stylish and synthos next season, or is it going to be better this season? Like, what's going to be better? Is it going to be worse? Is it getting nerfed? That's going to all be in there. Me and Spider took the liberty of looking through every single melee damage buff, changed, unchanged. We plugged it into the, multiplicative/additive system the correct way, and we have some calculations for you guys that hopefully will answer your questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking about the part 1 of melee changes in the Edge of Fate sandbox. So the first thing we're going to talk about is stacking, right? So there's 2 big changes here. The first thing that you've probably heard of is multiplicative system. The multiplicative system for melees in Destiny 2 is changing to an additive system. Okay, so previously in Destiny, if you had 2 melee buffs, for example, Synthos and Banner, you could just multiply those 2 numbers together and that would give you your final melee damage number when you multiply it by the base melee damage, right? So for example, let's say you have buff A, right? And it gives you a 2 times multiplier to your damage, aka a 100% increase, right? And then let's say you have buff B on top of that, and that gives you a 3 times damage multiplier, which is a 200% increase, right? What Bungie is basically doing is instead of this becoming a 6 times increase, now what it's going to be is plus, you can think of your base damage as like a 1.00 times multiplier, right? And then you would get plus 1 from this, and then you would get plus 2. And that would equal 4.00 times, if that makes sense, okay? So the way that you can do math now, and when it comes to like the sandbox, is when Bungie says that a certain melee damage bonus is a certain number, right? So it's like 200% bonus to melee damage. You can think about it like, plus 2 to the 1.00 times scalar that you have, okay? If that makes sense. So that's the system that we're moving to. Now the exception here that you'll see here is 30% from the melee stat. So a lot of us were probably kind of disappointed when we saw that grenades were being buffed by 65% at 200 melee, and supers were being buffed by 45% at 200 super. Now, the reason why I think now that Bungie only made melees be buffed by 30% is because this is a very sensitive number, right? Because later on in the comparison section, you'll see that when we have a bunch of additive factors and then a single multiplicative factor, which is going to be the melee stat, anytime you change the melee stat, even by 5% or 10%, it's going to really change the end result in terms of the total scalar. Okay, so that's probably why Bungie was a little tentative with increasing this stat. And you'll find that 30% is not necessarily a bad value when it comes to melee balancing as we move on into the comparison section. Okay, the second major change about stacking that I want to talk about is that there are no longer any stacking penalties. For those of you who have followed melee damage strategies over the past couple years, you're probably aware that Bungie has introduced these little, asterisks, these little conditions, where if you're using certain abilities with certain other abilities, you get a reduced scalar from one or more of the abilities. So for example, if you have Stylish Executioner active and then you have Biotic Enhancements, Stylish will make your Biotic Enhancements reduced from a 2.65 times multiplier to a 1.3 times multiplier. Okay. And so Bungie has kind of custom tuned the sandbox and made all these little exceptions here and there so that, melee damage doesn't get out of hand. And so now Bungie is saying basically with this new additive system, because it's much harder to get this exponential crazy high scaling by multiplying a bunch of different buffs together, it's a lot safer, right? Like for example, in the past, Banner of War in its current state going to the Edge of Fate is going to be a 100% increase to your melee damage, right? In the past, if Bungie was trying to retune this, that would literally be a 2 times increase to damage. So anytime you could slap on Banner on top of a melee strat, you would have 2 times more damage. Now it's +1 to the scalar. It's plus 100% of the initial value. And so it's a lot easier to balance and kind of tweak little levers here and there. And even if Bungie buffs something by like a fair amount, it's not going to have a big ripple effect on the rest of the sandbox because of the scaling that used to exist, right? So now, no matter what kind of melee stuff that you kind of stack with each other, as long as it can stack, as long as it is compatible, it's not going to have any sort of little penalty or like a little special condition, okay? Next up, we have Melees Part 2. Now, those of you who played during Lightfall introduction probably remembered that a lot of people were using Two-Tailed Fox and stuff like Iterative Loop with Volt Shot because weapon scalars used to affect jolt damage, right? And so Bungie saw this and was like, yo, people are doing way too much damage with Two-Tailed Fox on like Solo Nezarec, and they got rid of it. They got rid of it and they made jolt a consistent number across the entire sandbox. Bungie is giving that same treatment to Scorch and Ignition now. Okay, so Scorch and Ignition no longer scale with melee bonuses, which means that if you have for something like Biotic Enhancements, or you have, Knockout on your Consecration, that Ignition number, which is a pretty dominant portion of your damage, is not going to increase as a result of your melee buffs. Now, the other victim here is also Incinerator Snap. Some people have used Winter's Guile builds, for example, like in Solo Throne speedruns before. So that's going to, fly under the radar a little bit here. But we're going to talk about how much this actually affects Consecration and Snap, because I'm sure some of you are like, well, I know the Ignition is like a big part of it, but like how much? Is it like a 30% nerf? Is it a 40% nerf? We're going to discuss that when we get to the comparison section, but this is the underlying information that you need to know going forward. Next, we're going to talk about glaives. Now, glaives have been hit really, really hard because Bungie has made glaives unpowered melee status rather than kinetic, kind of a weird in-between weapon damage status that they used to be. So glaives will no longer, I didn't write this on the slide, but glaives will no longer benefit from weapon damage buffs like Lumina, Radiant, and Well like they used to. They now count as unpowered melees, which means they're buffed by stuff like Knockout, by stuff like Combination Blow, by a lot of different factors that you previously didn't really think about when it comes to glaive damage. So as a result, Bungie has made some compensatory nerfs. Minors, majors, mini bosses, we're not going to talk about too much because for the most part, stacking, like multiplicative stacking, changing to additive stacking is really going to change much more significantly when you have more stacking enabled, which really is more of a boss damage context, right? So I think glaive melees for the most part, when we're talking about like minors, majors, and stuff like that, if you're using it on like Hunter and Titan, where you already have these kind of background melee buffs, I think the outcome is not going to change too much. But for boss damage in particular, this is a big hit, right? Glaive melees, they're tanking a 50% nerf, which is really big, right? That's huge for a weapon family to be tanking that much of a nerf. And then Winterbite and Close to Melee in particular have been retuned as well. Winterbite has a 50% additional damage to boss multiplier when you have ammo, and that's going to change to 20%. And Close to Melee, as a result of being changed from a multiplier of 1.3 times, is getting doubled to 60% or plus 60%. So remember how I talked about in part 1 how a lot of the melee stuff in the sandbox is getting buffed to account for the fact that we are now in an additive system. Close to Melee is one of those things. Now the problem with this, if you notice in the italicized text at the bottom here, is that unless Winterbite gets a catalyst or its ammo bonus is multiplicative. So remember how I said that the only exception to the whole additive multiplicative rule was the melee stat? Well, unless Winterbite is a second exception where when you have ammo you do 20%, like 1.2 times multiplier to bosses, it is going to be worse than a legendary glaive with Close to Melee, which is kind of doesn't really make sense, right? Especially given that it's a heavy glaive, an exotic heavy glaive who has a special damage bonus to bosses as like part of its exotic effect. So it doesn't really make sense that that does less damage to a boss than like a legendary glaive. So we're assuming, me and Spider are both assuming that this 20% multiplier is going to be like a hidden kind of another exception to the melee additive rule. If it's not, it's literally going to be worse than a legendary glaive. Also, for those of you wondering, these reference numbers here do not include the 50% nerf to bosses and vehicles, because this is purely for comparative purposes between each other, between heavy, winter bite, and of course a legendary special glaive. But yeah, if you applied the 50% nerf to both these numbers, they would proportionally be like, the same difference, right? Okay, next up we have melees part 4. So obviously a lot of subclass stuff exists that increases melee damage, from combination blow to banner of war, etc, etc. And so Bungie has retuned a lot of these. I'm going to breeze through these because we're going to talk about them again when we go to the comparison section. But yeah, let's just go from left to right. I'll give you the numbers and I'll tell you what I think is going to happen with the actual fragment slash aspect slash whatever it is. So spark of feedback from 75 to 100%. This is the one where when you get melee damage to you, you do more melee damage on your next melee going out. I really don't think this is going to be relevant in the meta for the most part, outside of maybe Striker Titans who choose to use glaives as part of their loadout. I do think glaives are going to be pretty good on Striker Titan because, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm pretty sure glaives, because they're counted as unpowered melees now, will trigger knockout, which means they will heal you. But yeah, Striker Glaive, knockout, spark of feedback combination could be potentially good. Knockout has also been changed so that the 50 to powered and 100% to unpowered melees has been changed to 160% additive bonus. And a lot of these, you'll see it says no penalty on a lot of these. Many of these fragments and aspects had penalties before if you use them with stuff like biotic enhancements. That is all gone now, right? So all of these are no longer penalized, like we mentioned in that earlier slide. Combination blow. Now, this might be a little bit misleading, right? First of all, Bungie cited an incorrect number. They cited their pre-nerf combination blow numbers in the TWID, which is 309%. Combination blow currently at 3 stacks actually gives a 237.5% increase to melee damage. That's being changed to 400%. Now, 400% might look like a big number, but you got to remember, combination blow is restricted to a specific kind of melee, which is your unpowered melee, right? Whereas all of these other kind of buff stacking things that we've been talking about when it comes to consecration or shield bash or any of these things, the base melee damage is way higher than a regular melee. Whereas combination blow, it might be plus 400%, but it's to your base melee. And so you might think that's a very big number, but when it comes down to brass tacks and we do our little calculations in the comparison section, you'll see that combination blow has actually received an overall nerf. But we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, now the other interesting thing is that combination blow does affect glaive melee now, which could maybe give it a second wind in terms of being a little bit of a counteraction to the nerf that it received, and it also affects grapple melee. Now, if you were me, and if you were just like someone who's been paying attention to the Destiny sandbox, if Bungie didn't explicitly say that combination blow affects grapple melee, I think it doesn't, because it doesn't really make sense. That doesn't really seem like something they would do. But they said it explicitly that combination blow affects grapple melee, so go crazy, I guess. Well, you'll see what the results of that are going to be when we get to the grapple melee section. Okay, Roaring Flames has been changed from 73% to 200%, no longer has a penalty with Synthos. I don't think Roaring Flames is going to have any change in its endgame viability outside of potentially being used with Path of the Burning Steps for weapon damage. But we'll get there when we get to the armor exotic sections. In terms of the actual melee damage potential stuff, I don't think Roaring Flames is really going to be crazy. Okay. Next up, we have Stylish Executioner. Stylish Executioner, not much has changed here. Before, the grapple melee strategy with Stylish Executioner was you would 1-2 punch a boss target that was tethered, and then an add in the tether because it's suppressed and dies would give you Stylish, and then you would grapple while you're getting Stylish, you'd be invisible, and then you'd hit the boss with your grapple melee and 1-2 punch coming out of invisibility. Now they've given us a bigger window that's less penalizing for actually getting that melee damage bonus and the weaken as well. And so, that's potentially useful. I don't know how much it's going to affect grapple melee for the most part, but I don't think this is really going to change how and when people use Stylish, which currently is either grapple melee strategies or it's going to be just like combination blow stuff with Winter Shroud, right? So I don't think either of those use cases is going to change, which is why I wrote no change in use. Next up, we have Offensive Bulwark. Now this one I was kind of excited about because I envisioned in my head, you could put down a Titan glaive bubble, you could maybe thunder crash the boss and then swap to void and then start like glaive meleeing the boss inside of your bubble with Offensive Bulwark. But the more I think about it, right, you really need big numbers on your subclass buffs in order for them to be significant in this new additive sandbox. And 160% is plus 1.6 to your scalar. And later on in this comparison section, you're going to see that that's actually not that much. And although it is kind of like free damage just for being inside of a void overshield, it's really not enough to push Titans over the edge. Because keep in mind, right? Combination blow affects glaive melees, and that's a 400% increase. And that's not even an aspect, right? So yeah, that's something to keep in mind when we're comparing, against, between and against subclasses and classes, right? So again, maybe it could be used for glaive DPS on Titan specifically, but I don't think it's particularly amazing. Banner of War, you know, change from 40% multiplicative to 100% additive. No penalty when being used biotic or worm god or anything like that. And you get the full glaive bonus because glaives now count as unpowered melees. Instead of getting that reduced 25% versus 40% bonus that they had in the past, you now get a 100% additive increase to your glaive bonus, which is, again, not that high, right? It's +1 to your scalar, which is even lower than Bulwark. And although it is a team-wide buff, you know, Banner of War isn't going to be like absolutely necessary now when it comes to melee damage. In fact, if you're just like one person or just two people, for example, it might not even be worth having Banner, and it might be worth pursuing maybe Combination Blow instead, because that's a much higher bonus and doesn't, you know, it's like how do I put this? It's like, you know, when you're in a 2-man damage scenario, you don't want to have one person on galley because it tanks their damage even if it increases one person's damage. The nerfed person's damage, it accounts for more of the entire team's damage, right? So that's kind of my thought with Banner, right? Maybe you'd rather have 2 combination blow grapple meleeers rather than having 1 Banner, 1 combination, right? Okay, finally we have Facet of Courage, which in my opinion is really just going to affect Winter's Shroud. For those of you who are not aware, Facet of Courage used to buff light ability damage to darkness debuff targets by 10% if you're on Prismatic and you have the Fragment on, obviously. But unfortunately, Prismatic Titan and Prismatic Warlock don't really have good access to being able to darkness debuff targets that are promptly going to be meleeed by a powerful light ability, right? If that makes sense. And so the melee damage portion of this Facet of Courage was specifically buffed to 50%. So again, plus 0.5 is not that much, but I guess it's like a thing that exists. I mean, I'm hoping that the 10% multiplicative bonus from Facet of Courage for other abilities stays the same though, right? Because plus 0.5 is not very high, right? But on Hunter, if you're on, you know, Winter Shroud and Stylish Executioner, you are punching, you know, darkness debuff targets all the time, and your melee damage is light based, right? It's arc because it's combination blow. So yeah, Winter Shroud could be good, right? Could be good. I mean, not great, but it's a free little, you know, little bonus, I suppose. Okay, that's it for Melee's Part 4. Let's go to Melee's Part 5 now. We're going to be talking about exotic buffs. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Atheris' Embrace. For those of you who are big fans of the Div 1-2 punch throwing knife combo that people were using to like solo GMs back then, it's now going to, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but in the comparison section, you'll see that it's getting a slight buff overall, despite the fact that we're moving to an additive system, thanks to this. It's getting an increase from 200 to 300%. Liar's Handshake, again, 200 to 400%. Again, this is another kind of misleading one. It looks like a big number, but again, it's not enough to counteract what has happened to it as a result of the additive changes, because when your base damage for your melee is as low as it is on combination blow, because it's literally buffing an unpowered melee, whereas a lot of these other exotics that are suffering less, they haven't been affected as heavily by the additive change because the base damage of the actual melee, like a consecration, is way higher than just like a regular punch. And so Liar's Handshake and Combination Blow both getting buffed to 400% with no penalty sounds like a really big deal, but it is needed. It's needed, and it's still not enough to bring Combination Blow up to where it was before. Not to spoil anything, but we'll get there when we get there. Okay, but still, I don't think it's going to change in use. I think people are still going to use Combination Blow because, you know, it's pretty good. Okay, Ophidius Faith, I don't think it's going to change much. I mean, you can maybe explore like knife damage a little bit, which is why I wrote that there, but and realistically, I don't think it's going to change too much, right? I think if you wanted like a cool knife one-shot build, I would just go Atheris. Ophidius Faith could be okay, but yeah, I don't think it's insanely strong. Yeah. Triton Vice from 100 to 200% could be used for glaive DPS. We're going to talk about it when we get to the comparison section, so I'm going to skip it for now. Heart of Inmost Light, nobody uses this exotic because of class items anymore, and the 50% plus 0.5 really additive to your melee damage is absolutely not going to do anything whatsoever to the usability of this exotic. Class items are still going to reign supreme. Peregrine Greaves. Okay, so Peregrine Greaves, we'll talk more about this in the comparison section, but the damage to Tormentors, Champs, mini-bosses has not changed. That's still plus 1000%. Against just like actual bosses though, it went from 363 to 400%, which is essentially like, that's like a non-factor, especially when we're talking about additive versus multiplicative. A difference of, what is that, like 37% is like nothing. That's like literally nothing. You won't notice it. Okay. Next up we have Syntheseps, unchanged, right? So a lot of the armor exotics around Syntheseps have been buffed, but I guess Bungie is seeing that Synthos has, you know, been really OP for a long time, and so they didn't change it. They didn't buff it, even though it is a fairly low increase now. It's like plus 1.65, which is not great, But I guess synthos are like very easy to use and, you know, don't require you to get kills or anything. So kind of makes sense, I suppose. No change in use there. Wishful Ignorance. This one I'm going to need to test a little bit. Fleshit Storm is pretty good in my kind of speaker notes here. Fleshit Storm, I believe, does around 20% more damage than Frenzied Blade. And on top of that, also unravels. And on top of that, also doesn't consume a full melee charge. So maybe Wishful Ignorance with like the chunk scaler increase from 100 or 200 melee rather. Could be potentially good, right? Maybe you can spam Wishful Ignorance. I don't know. I'll have to test that. This is something that, you know, I haven't really measured Wishful Ignorance DPS much in the past. But there's a chance that you stay on synthos as well instead of swapping to Wishful Ignorance. We'll see. We'll see. And then finally, Wormgod and Winters increase to plus 400% rather than 275% multiplicative. But again, no change in use. Also, Bungie, if you are seeing / reading / hearing this, please change Winter's Guile to a meter so that people can use it with Lightning Surge. Thank you. Next up, we have Melee's Part 6. Other buffs, small stuff, okay? The first thing, 1-2 punch. Now, a lot of people, you know, they kind of looked at this twit at face value and they're like, what? You're buffing 1-2 punch? What are you guys doing? Are you crazy? Are you crazy? No. Okay. Overall, this is actually technically like a system-wide nerf, I guess. But 1-2 punch is now 100 to 150%. Nothing crazy, right? Honestly, like it maybe could have been buffed to 200%. I still don't think it would have made that much of a difference, to be honest. It now supports all melees, which is kind of nice, and it lasts for 3 seconds. It lasts for 3 seconds. Now the thing is, Bastion. Bastion is the real glow up here. Okay, Bastion got buffed to 300%, and Bastion allows you to continuously melee, right? 1-2 punch, the perk disappears once you melee once, right? And so if you use it with something like Consecration, it only affects the first wave. It disappears on the second wave. If you use it on, you know, just anything where you're constantly meleeing stuff, you have to reshoot over and over and over, right? Bastion, on the other hand, it has a slightly bigger window, not too much of a change, but you can trigger it and then just grapple melee like 3 times, right? So pretty good stuff from Bastion, and you're going to see it as my kind of miscellaneous melee buff of choice when we come to the comparison section, and for good reason, okay? Speaking of comparisons, let's go ahead and talk about them. First up, we have Warlock. So I handpicked all of the melee damage sources that I think are like important on specific classes. Warlock is obviously like the least melee friendly class, I suppose. So there's only 4 of them. But let's go ahead and talk about them. Warlock Lightning Surge is getting an overall pretty substantial buff, I would say. You can use 1-2 punch with Lightning Surge fairly easily. By the way, these kind of options for stacking, what I chose to put on these slides is how I think that melee option is going to be most reasonably and realistically used. So for example, Bastion feels a bit weird to use on Lightning Surge, right? Lightning Surge, usually you're kind of Lightning Surging into a middle of a bunch of enemies. You're not going to have time to like dump a bunch of your pellets into a single like large target and then Lightning Surge afterward, right? It just seems kind of awkward, right? So it kind of makes sense that you'd be able to maybe just 1-2 punch an ad, maybe kill it or something, and then go on like a little Lightning Surge after that and get like an increase to damage. Anything I've put in yellow, by the way, is like, you could maybe do that, but it's not necessarily like super conducive to the gameplay, right? But regardless, even if you didn't have 1-2 punch, it's still a small increase over final shape. So Lightning Surge has received an overall small buff. Also, a trend you're going to see here as we move through the melees from part 7 to part 8 to part 9 with the different classes is that overall, the kind of status of the changes looks something like this, like an upside down bell curve, okay? So anything that has a low number of buffs generally is going to be better than final shape because of the 1.3 times multiplier from 200 melee, and then you have an additive stat which is either better or the same as before. Anything that has like 2 to 3 buffs is going to be worse than final shape, generally speaking, because around there is when you don't have the crazy buff stacking with the non-penalized stuff like you used to, and you know, obviously additive starts to kick in there, like the punishment of being in an additive system, right? And then when you have a lot of buffs, right, because this new system of additiveness, okay, because of this new system, you're able to stack maybe a lot more than you used to, especially on stuff like grapple melee, and so maybe you're going to start to see stuff that's better here, but this is kind of like in between, right? This can be better or worse. All right, moving on, we have Incinerator Snap. This one with Consecration, I had to do some work. Shout out to Spider, he did some testing for finding values here. The ignition from Incinerator Snap accounts for about 60.2% of the total damage of a snap. And so as a result, the nerf is not as big as you might think, right? It's not like a 3.75 times nerf because the entire damage doesn't go down to like 1x. It's down to like an equivalent 2.59 times, which is like, you know, That's all right, I suppose. And like you could use 1-2 punch to increase the damage of the actual snap fan projectiles, but I don't think anyone's going to do that. Doesn't really make sense to do that on snap, to be honest. It's just kind of awkward. So yeah, snap build has been nerfed by a bit, but it's not as much as you might think. Okay, glaive melees. This is going to be a recurring trend as we go from warlock to hunter to titan. But glaive melee and boss damage is definitely like gutted. It's gutted by a fair amount on warlock, especially, right? Because you don't have the stuff like combination blow or knockout or any of that stuff to be able to buff your glaive melee damage, especially if you want to use synthos. Warlock class item, you know, if you look at the aspects on warlock, you don't really have anything that's like really good for buffing melee damage, really. So yeah, as you can see here, 4.69 times down to 2.76 times. And again, like we talked about, winter bite is slightly better, assuming the winter bite buff is multiplicative, which we don't know yet. Okay. Grapple melee damage, on the other hand, this is a big question. Okay, this is a big question that we don't have answered yet. And that is, does grapple melee still count as grenade damage for the purposes of calculation, right? Because if it does, you can use Verity, which is still multiplicative as far as we know, unless tomorrow or next week or something, Bungie announces that grenade damage multipliers are also now going to be changed to additive, which I'd be surprised about because there's way less grenade damage multipliers than there are melee in this game. So yeah, unless this gets changed to additive, Verity is now better for grapple meleeing than Syntho or anything else like that because it's a multiplier. And then Grenade 200 also increases your melee by 1.65 times, right? And so as a result of this, you get a 21.45 times multiplier compared to the 13 from before. Now that is, I've also included here in the bottom right here, even if this is gone, and we change this to Synthos, right? Even if we change this to Syntho. Oh, I guess Warlock doesn't even have access to Syntho, does it, on Prismatic? Okay, well, you can ignore that. But regardless, even if you get rid of the grapple melee damage bonuses, the difference is not that high. Oh, sorry, this would be Winters. This would be Winters and not Syntho. But regardless, the difference is not that high. Okay, it's not that high compared to before. It's not like a big nerf or anything. But if grenade damage does stack, if grenade 200 counts, if Verity counts, and it does count as grenade damage grapple melee does, then you're going to see like a big increase. Okay, next we have Hunter. Okay, so Hunter, this is a big one. This is more interesting, right? Combination blow is getting nerfed by quite a bit. Okay, so combination blow used to be a 3.237 times increase. For liars, I took the average of 2 melees because you need 2 melees to trigger it. And then I got 2 times, I got stylish 3 times, and courage 1.1 times because a lot of the time on this build you're going to be using Winter's Shroud, and so you get that 1.1 times multiplier for a 21.36 times multiplier to your base melee damage. In Edge of Fate, this is going to change, right? You have this, you have this, you have this. You have courage, which is now plus 0.5, like I talked about. This is almost nothing. And then you have the 1.3 times from your melee. And so as a result, all of these things combined result in a 13.65 times multiplier. Now, the kicker here is that technically, I mean, combination blow does affect grapple melee, and it also affects glaive melee. So this could be offset by choosing to use a lot of grapple melees or choosing to use a lot of glaive melees instead. But obviously, the combination blow itself still needs to be used to stack the actual buff. Atheris 1-2 punch, we already talked about this, from 6 to 7.15 times, small increase. I just put like Syntho Threaded Spike in here because a lot of people use Threaded Spike, and the damage of Threaded Spike is actually not too bad, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to invest into the melee stat to get the Threaded Spike back faster because it's a useful melee to have to sever an entire room of ads. And so if you do choose to use Synthos with it, it is like a small increase as well. Next up, we have glaive meleeing. I think Hunter is maybe the best glaive melee class just because combination blow adds that +4, which is like a really big number to glaive melee damage. And so technically Hunter will have more glaive melee damage than before. You'd have Triton instead of Syntho, which is again, similar requirements. It's not like you need to like stack Worm God or anything like that. You have close to melee, you have banner from your teammate. And then obviously I have the glaive nerf baked in here and melee 200. For a total of 5.59 times with a 6.24 times multiplier if Winter Bite is again multiplicative. Finally, we have grapple melee, the thing everyone has been asking about like on Hunter. And yeah, this is pretty crazy. I don't think it needs to speak for itself. I really don't think Bungie is going to allow grapple melee to continue counting as grenade damage because of this. Like, this is a little much in my opinion, right? And the thing is, this doesn't even require stylish. The problem with stylish grapple melees is while they were very strong, because you had to go invisible every single melee, it's just not realistic to hit this scalar every single time. This, on the other hand, you have Verity, which is, you know, annoying to upkeep, but it's not that bad. And then you have Combination Blow, which is 20 seconds, more than long enough. And the upkeep here is like, you know, it's a lot easier than having to go invisibility and, you know, needing ads nearby and having to be on tether and stuff like that. So this is insanely high, right? And even without grenade stacking, you take these two out and you replace it with Syntho, it's still 13.85 times. So bread and butter, yes, grapple melee is getting better on Hunter, regardless of whether or not the grenade changes are going to change whether or not grapple melee counts as grenade damage for buffing purposes. Okay, finally we have Titan, the melee class, eh? So the first three, we have Peregrine Greaves. Peregrine Greaves overall is getting nerfed. Peregrine Greaves, shoulder charge, you know, melee abilities are getting nerfed. You can see here the scalars are going down, even with stuff like, you know, Spark of Feedback, which is annoying to trigger. And you'll notice that, yeah, it's just like a rather big nerf, like Bulwark being 2 times. I think the damage goes up slightly, obviously, if you have a, you know, 1.3 times multiplier from melee 200 stat and you have nothing else stacked. But a lot of these builds rely on having stuff stacked, right? Like the Peregrine build relied on having Bulwark, right? And so the second you add in another multiplier and it becomes a multiplication problem rather than just having a 1.3x versus no buff at all, and, you know, it swings in the final shape's favor, right? So this has definitely been nerfed, and the situation gets even worse when you account for the fact that on mini bosses, which is where this build was used neutrally. These are boss damage numbers, by the way, right? On mini bosses, where it's now going from times 10 or times 11, rather. Is it times 11? Yeah, it's times 11 down to plus 1000%. That's a big difference, right? That's a big difference. The second you add in something like Bulwark, which is a times 2 multiplier before, it's like, you know, it compounds. It compounds, right? So neutrally, these builds are going to be a lot worse as well. Well, not a lot worse, but, you know, they're still going to, I'm sure you'll probably still be able to one-shot stuff, but, you know, just numerically, they're going to be worse. Okay, a big winner, on the other hand, to counter that, is going to be Throwing Hammer, okay? Throwing Hammer is receiving almost over a double damage buff as a result of now being compatible with 1-2 punch. Roaring Flames is no longer penalized with Synthos, and you have the melee 200 bonus, right? And for those of you who have not seen Final Shape footage, Spider went through some footage for me, and we found out that Throwing Hammer basically has its internal cooldown removed, right? So Throwing Hammer, if you're not aware, when you pick up a Throwing Hammer, it like fills up your melee, but it takes a while before you can use your melee again, right? When people were picking up hammers in the footage that we were watching, I don't even think they had 200 melee, but their melee was filling up pretty much instantly, right? So this internal cooldown is either gone or like way less now. So I can see a world where like Solar Titan with Path of Burning Steps and stuff like that could be potentially more usable in in-game content as a result of this change. Now, Consecration, okay? So a lot of people are thinking Consecration is completely unusable now. So Consecration, the thing about it is its overall total damage, right? So the way Consecration works is you have wave 1 when you go up, wave 2 when you slam down, and then you have the ignition, okay? Wave 1 does almost nothing, okay? Wave 2 and the ignition does about 2/3 of the damage, and wave 2 does about 1/3 of the damage. And so the fact that the ignition no longer has melee buffs applied to it is a pretty big deal, but the actual total change to the buffs itself here, because remember, you're getting more melee buffs on this part, right? So this part's going up, but this part is going way down, right? So there's a bit of a counteraction here, right? And so at the end of the day, the damage reduction is, I believe, something like 30 to 35%, which numerically in my head is actually not that bad, especially if you're using Consecration specifically to kill red bars and maybe slightly weaker orange bars. The second you try to start killing mini bosses or orange bars with it, or like, you know, some tankier ultras maybe, is where Consecration, you're going to start to see its weaknesses a little bit. And on top of that, because the ignition is really going to be the big source of the splash damage, right? That's going to be base ignition damage now, especially... It's going to be especially worse, by the way. For those of you that don't know, by the way, Consecration has an inbuilt inherent 20% increase to the ignition damage that comes from the second wave hitting a scorched target. And this is, you know, completely independent from melee buffs, like, you know, from Synthos or Knockout or whatever. So we don't know if Bungie's going to remove this 20% increase or not. If they do, this number is going to go even lower, but I'm going to assume that they're not going to do that. And so if they don't do that and the ignition stays 20% buffed compared to like a regular ignition from like a snap or something like that, then Consecration, it's like still going to be usable, but the splash damage from the ignition is going to be a lot lower. And, you know, obviously when it comes to tankier targets, it's still going to be a bit worse. And to counteract that, by the way, with the melee changes in the final shape, you're going to be getting a lot more Consecrations, right? So kind of two ways of looking at it, but obviously this is a pretty big nerf. Frenzied Blade and by extension Fleshed Storm are getting buffed as well by a relatively small amount. But you know, it could be something to look into, right? I'm interested to see maybe some Fleshed Storm strategies with Wishful Ignorance. So, you know, we'll definitely check in on that in the future, but not a top priority right now, but just something I guess you should be aware of. And then finally, we have Glaive and Grapple Melee on Titan specifically. So Grapple Melee used to be not that great on Titan. For those of you who have seen our Atheon kill from 6-man VOG speedruns, we actually have a Titan for supportive purposes to give us, to give us Banner of War, which is a team buff. And then we actually have 2 primary damage dealers on Winner's Guile Warlock, right? And the reason for this is because when you have Banner of War and you have Synthos equipped, or you have like Worm God equipped, you get a penalty for your Grapple Melee damage, right? The bonus from Banner of War is reduced for you. But for your allies, it isn't. Now that's changing. There's no penalty anymore, right? And so Titan, Glaive melee damage, I mean, this is largely similar to what we talked about before. Bulwark is way worse than Combination Blow, so Hunter is going to be better for Glaive melee damage in that case. But Grapple melee, right? Grapple melee, you see here, 19.31 times and 11.7 times, even with no grenade stacking. So even if we got rid of the grenade 200 bonus, and we just had raw, just Worm God, Banner, Bastion, melee 200, it's still an overall damage increase against what Grapple Melee used to be without grenade stacking. Okay, so that's it for melee comparison stuff. I hope these numbers have satisfied you guys. I've color coded them nicely so you can see what's better and what's worse before and after the changes. We're going to summarize this in the implications section as well, but for the most part, all you need to know is Grapple Melees are largely staying the same, assuming the grenade stat and grenade buffs do not work with Grapple Melee in the future, a change that I think Bungie is going to make for the sake of the balance of their game. Otherwise, you know, things will run amok and chaos will break loose. But, you know, just if we ignore that, right? The Grapple Melee damage stacking, it's pretty similar. It's like a little bit better, maybe 10, 15, 20% better. It's a bit better. Glaive melees are a bit worse, except for on Hunter. And then the other melees, for the most part, I mean, like base melee stuff, like non-consecration stuff, like Throwing Hammer, Frenzied Blade. These are receiving some buffs, especially Throwing Hammer as well, with that internal cooldown buff is pretty nice. And then Combination Blow is receiving like a small nerf, and then Lightning Surge is getting a small buff. That's the gist of it. Okay. Next up, we have neutral exotics. So we're moving on to the armor exotic section of this video. 6 exotics were changed on Hunter. Dragon's Shadow is now basically a PvP exotic, right? It doesn't give you really anything for PvE outside of a move and a sprint increase. They didn't really say whether this bypasses the cap. If it does, could be useful in speedrunning for like running relics and stuff like that. But for the most part, just ignore Dragon's Shadow for now, because the useful stuff from Dragon's Shadow, which is of course the triple weapon reload, has been transferred to Speedloader Slacks. Now, this is technically a nerf if you were using like a Dragon Coyote class item in the past on Prismatic, because now obviously that functionality is gone now and you don't have a Speedloader Coyote class item, right? So that's unfortunate. However, Speedloader Slacks have, you know, so to speak, picked up the slack because you now get your dodge back on sustained damage. Now, this sustained damage trigger is very interesting. We're going to talk about this at the end of the video because it really hasn't been a thing in Destiny for the most part until now. Maybe something from the new game director or something like that. There are just a bunch of risks or a bunch of feature sets or a bunch of like game design philosophies that Bungie has taken in this recent TWID that have not been a thing in years or have never been a thing in Destiny. So I'm going to talk about how that's interesting at the end of the video. But for now, just know that Speedloader Slacks, on top of their original tight fit buffs, where you were able to buff your teammates' reload and handling, they now do the D-Shadow triple reload thing. And again, you get your dodge back on sustained damage. So you could use this for weapon DPS if you don't want to have like Nighthawk on or something like that. Okay. Next up, we have Mask of Bacchus. This is a really interesting one. 30% non-surge buff. A 30% non-surge buff that stacks up to 3 times. I assume that when you use Light Shift now, it doesn't put your dodge in an unchargeable state, and that you're able to charge it while you have Light Shift in order to Light Shift again. Okay, because the way it works is every time you dodge, you get a stack of Light Shift, and then you kill stuff, and that gets your dodge back, and then you get Light Shift again, and you get Light Shift again, and eventually you have 30% increase. And this applies to Stasis, Arc, and Lord of Wolves. Okay, Stasis weapons, Arc weapons, and Lord of Wolves. So it could be potentially interesting, right? Interestingly enough, Warlock did not receive a universally non-surge stackable weapon buff exotic because I guess Warlock has Sanguine, right? Sanguine is Warlock's little cheat code to doing a lot of damage. Whereas Mask of Bacchus, I suppose, is stackable, and then Titan has Path of Burning Steps, which we'll talk about in just a second. Khepris, I don't think this is going to change how people use this exotic. Basically, if you weaken a target and you kill the target, it explodes into Weakening Cloud, and then you get Smoke Bomb energy back. I don't think people are going to really use this, though, because the class items on Prismatic are just too strong. Oathkeeper, this is a pretty small change, to be honest. They also made the impact scaling on draw time, like they made the curve more forgiving and front-loaded more of the damage, but I really don't think Oathkeeper is really going to be like a meta exotic in the next season or anything like that, so no change in use in my opinion. And then finally, Blight Ranger, that you guys have probably seen the post on Reddit of some guy just absolutely crashing out and complaining about this thing. I agree. I mean, like, yeah, this thing's pretty useless. I mean, you can make orbs with it. It shits orbs, but, you know, with the super stat changing with how it is next season, not to spoil anything, but I don't think super generation is going to be a problem next season. That's all I'm going to say. And so, yeah, Blight Ranger, pretty useless. Pretty useless. No change in use, no change in use, no change in use. We talked about these three. Okay, moving on. Titan, Crest of Alpha Lupi is actually quite a good change. I like this change. Okay, so you get healing pulses to your teammates when you do sustained damage from your barricade. This feature is not on the class item, by the way, but you also get class ability back when you heal your teammates. So the healing pulse on sustained damage, that's just going to be on the actual exotic and not on the class item, just to be clear. And so the first thing that should jump to your mind here is Storm's Cape, right? Storm's Keep, not only do you like getting your barricade back when you are, you know, just sitting behind your barricade so you can have more and more and more rally barricades to stack up that bull charge faster, but on top of this, you get to heal your teammates on Arc Titan, a supportive thing. So, and like Arc Titan, I mean, you could put on Curious, but like if you're just sitting behind your barricade and it's like a non-T-crashable boss, or like you've already T-crashed, you want to come back to your damage and swap to a different exotic to support your teammates, Titan didn't really have like a Sanguine or like a default damage exotic, and so this is the one, guys. This is the one. Next up we have Phoenix Cradle. I don't think this is going to really change the use. Sunspot extension on sustained solar weapon damage, not something that was really holding Solar Titan back, Sunspot extension. And Sunspot on buffing allies is kind of nice, but for the most part, if you're playing Solar Titan correctly, you're making sunspots everywhere regardless. So I don't think this is really going to change the use that much. Mark 44 Stand-asides. Yeah, you can read this. It's just endgame PvE, not really relevant. Path of the Burning Steps. We talked about this when we were talking about Bacchus. Roaring Flames now gives you a 3-stackable 20% solar weapon damage boost. 15% ignition boost is kind of whatever, that's not that important. But 20% solar weapon damage boost. That's big. That's big because Roaring Flames lasts 20 seconds. Light Shift does not last 20 seconds and requires you to stack it 3 times, I assume by dodging 3 times, right? Whereas Roaring Flames, you could stack this instantly by just killing 3 ads instantly, right? So yeah, definitely usable for weapon DPS, and especially with how many meta heavy solar weapons we've had, right? I mean, I'm thinking Apex, I'm thinking Hezen, I'm thinking, you know, we've had plenty of solar legendaries, solar exotics, you know, that are good for damage. Oh yeah, Lord of Wolves too, don't forget about that, right? So yeah, we've had plenty of meta stuff that is going to be affected by Roaring Flames, although obviously you will have to forego having a solid damage super in the form of T-Crash if you choose to go down this route, okay? Abeyant Leap, increased lash suspend on the duration, finally sort of undoing the suspend nerf, I guess, that happened like years ago or whatever. I don't think people are going to use this as a result, but you know, that's cool, I suppose. And then finally, an interesting change that I'm actually a big fan of is there's going to be a 10 stackable ammo generation, and also stability, but I didn't include that because that's not really a PvE change, but ammo generation and damage boost to autos and LMGs. So for those of you who are not aware, right, weapons like Thunderlord and weapons like Retrofit Escapade with 4 times a charm and Target Lock, they're not that far away from being pretty good in contest content for like actual boss damage. They just need like a little push. And if this is anywhere near like as big as some of these other changes, like 20% over here, you could see this being like an actual viable option. But I think the biggest and most obvious thing to pair with Actium Warwick here is Choir. Choir's a special auto. It does crazy good ad clear. It's great ammo efficiency, and it's a damage boost. It's a damage boost to Choir, and knowing Bungie, right, they're probably going to balance these separately. Autos are maybe going to get like a 30% buff at 10 stacks, and LMGs are probably going to get like a 10% buff or something like that, right? Maybe 15. So Choir is an auto, even if it's a special ammo auto. They might make a special case for it because it's, you know, it does a lot of damage, but a 30% damage increase to Choir on top of getting more ammo? I don't know, man. Sign me up. Double special, sign me up, right? I'm not playing Titan on day one, you know, sign me up. Okay, next up we have Warlock. Okay, Warlock. A Starfire, I'm going to warn people about. I do think Starfire is a little overrated by the people are saying that it, you know, it's going to be meta or something on the next day one. I do think even Boots of the Assembler and, you know, Speaker Sight are going to be generally better supportive exotics for the most part and are safer picks for contest. But if you want something offensive, remember, Starfire is getting, if you have 200 grenade, 65% increase, a 65% increase to the nukes that you used to be able to throw out. It works with Radiant now, which is an excellent change, something they should have changed when Solar 3.0 came out, to be honest. But yeah, it works with Radiant now, which is excellent. The damage chunks have doubled, so every time you do damage to a target while you're Radiant or you're in an Emp Rift, it's gone from 2.5% to 5%. This used to be 20%. And with 200 grenade, which increases the grenade chunk scalars, you get a third of your original. I think it's like around 7.5% or something like that per tick. So it's nowhere near as good as old Starfire, guys. You got to remember, it's nowhere near. It's still a third of old Starfire chunks per damage. But do remember, you do get chunks from killing stuff, right? Even though that's been nerfed to 15%, which is definitely going to help offset part of this, because you know, you're throwing Starfire nades, you're going to be like, you know, nuking stuff, nuking red bars. So you're going to get a lot of grenade energy back. And of course, the actual 100 grenade scalar is higher, naturally speaking, compared to just like what we have right now. And so on top of like Ember of Benevolence and stuff like that, you're definitely going to have much better uptime than before, but I don't know if it's going to be as high as the old Starfire. And on top of that, the sandbox has shifted a lot around Starfire. And so, yeah, I don't know. Are you going to take this over like a healing focus build on day one if you're on Solar Warlock? We'll have to see. Okay. Wings of Sacred Dawn, you get like a Manticore effect while you're floating. Yeah, you get restoration and triple reload on solar weapon kills. Definitely nice for quality of life, but I don't think it's valuable enough to take over something like this or something like this or something like speakers, right? So we're going to skip over that. Felwinter's Helm, I like this change. It's purely positive, right? Powered melee damage now does a 15% weaken. So this is kind of nice because you have a self-sustaining debuff extension loop, because if you finisher, like for example, let's say you're in Prismatic Warlock, so you have 3 Arcane Needles, and let's say you finisher an ad near a boss, so you finishered, and that, I don't know, debuffs the boss for 15 seconds, then you can Arcane Needle, which will extend again by 15 seconds, you can Arcane Needle, which will again extend by 15 seconds, and then you can Arcane Needle, which will again extend by 15 seconds. That says 13, 15, but yeah, you see what I'm getting at here? So multi-charge melees, or just melees that recharge quickly during damage, they can be very good for a debuff extension. So nice. I like this change. Good. Even though it means you have to be on off Sanguine, right? Next up, we have Prometheum Spur. Some people were jokingly saying this is going to be good. I think it might be good in PvP, to be honest, because like you could just place on a Rift and get free Radiant for getting a kill. But for the most part, and it also splashes Radiant on your teammates, which is kind of nice. But for the most part, I do think, you know, Boots of the Assembler and just the natural Benevolence kit is going to be more than self-sufficient and have better positive effects than Prometheum Spur. Getting Radiant is really, really easy on Solar Warlock, you know, for the most part. And Cure, unless it's like maybe Cure ×2 or something like that, not amazing, to be honest. So potentially worth experimenting with, but I don't think it's going to be like a meta shifter. I think Starfire has a better chance than that. Boots of the Assembler. This is kind of a big-ish one. So much like Crest of Alpha Lupi, right? Boots of the Assembler also is going to be, I think, a fundamental pick for doing boss damage. And the reason for that is because in the past, Boots of the Assembler was annoying to use because it wouldn't target players that are in rifts or in a well. And now they said explicitly that it's going to target players that are in a rift. I assume that also means it's going to target players that are, you know, in a well. It also has a 40-meter range now, which is up from 25, which is pretty nice for just playing neutrally. Like if you want to use Boots of the Assembler, just, you know, during day one, just in an encounter, just sitting in the back and healing your teammates from a longer range. That's pretty nice. And you get class ability energy back when you have your Seekers impact targets, which is also pretty nice. So for the most part, I think the neutral stuff is, you know, again, needs to be questioned, needs to be tested. We don't really know for sure, but definitely it's going to be used for weapon DPS, because a lot of the quality of life changes where they say that, you know, it wouldn't target players that have already gone above, etc. And, you know, it wouldn't like interrupt itself and has bigger range and it targets players in wells. Like this just sounds perfect for one player to have on to give their entire team essentially a Lumina buff for the entire damage phase. Now, uptime wise, whether it actually targets players in wells or not, we're going to have to see. But if it does, if it works the way I think it does, this is going to be another essential part of the damage kit in Destiny 2, just like Crest of Alpha Lupi, if you're a Stormscape Titan. Okay, finally, Geomag Stabilizers. I don't think people were probably seriously considering taking this into day one for the most part, but yeah, 7 to 4% per trace, kind of a deserved nerf, I suppose. But again, you are getting a lot of super generation buffs next season, so I don't think people are going to be that upset about this. I think it's largely going to feel the same-ish. Instead, they gave the topping off buff like a bit of a stronger, I don't know, potent effect, where you basically instantly go from 5 to 10 bull charge if you sprint. I think you only need to wait a second, and then like every 1/3 of a second, it gives you a stack. So basically like 3 seconds of sprinting and you have like full bull charge. That being said, with how easy bull charge is to stack once you already have it, not a particularly good investment, and especially given that you need to sprint. Sprinting means you can't shoot. not amazing, right? So I think no change in use for the most part. Okay. Finally, we have implications. So I talked a lot, right? What does this all mean? Grapple melee is either going to be way better, way better if the grenade stuff stacks, right? So if Verity works with it, if the grenade stat with the 65% multiplier, if that works with it, grapple melee is going to be off the charts, off the wall, just crazy, okay? Otherwise, grapple melee is going to vary. It's going to be either a little bit worse on some classes, I think on one class, maybe warlock, and then on the other two classes, it's just going to be a little bit better, right? So like 10, 11, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15% better, okay? Sorry, I meant to say like 10, 20, 30%. I don't know why I just listed a bunch of twin numbers. My bad. Okay. Next up, we have glaive melee. Glaive melee is worse in almost all cases, unfortunately. It is better on Hunter because combination blow is a very high multiplier which works with glaive melee, but that also runs into its own restrictions. So glaive melee for the most part is worse. Yeah, glaive melee is worse for the most part. Other melees that might be of interest to you. Winter Snap, 31% worse. Syntho Consecration, 33% worse. Syntho Lightning Surge, over twice as good. Liars with Combination Blow, 36% worse. Atheris with Weighted Throwing Knife, 19% better. Peregrine Charges, 20 to 30% worse. Syntho Hammer, over double better, right? See both of these? Over double better, which is pretty nice. Glacial Quake also, in the past, has historically had its light attack, where you just kind of shiver strike into the enemy, pretty spammable, right? And also tends to stack with unpowered melee damage buffs. So we'll have to see whether or not you can use Glacial Quake with like a starter class item and like proc knockout and stuff and a bunch of other stuff and potentially, I don't know, get a bunch of light attack damage on that super. But for now, we'll leave that on the drawing board until we actually get our hands on the patch, right? Next up, we have our last slide, which is going to be the 4 kind of meta shift / sandbox design philosophy stuff that I want to talk about. Let me change to a different marker color. So number 1 is the return of non-surge exotic bonuses. So if you guys remember in the past, Ballador's Wrathweavers and Baccharis as well, right? And I believe a couple other exotics, they had stackable non-surge exotic bonuses, and Bungie, for whatever reason, whether it's resources or because of a game director standpoint or a sandbox designer standpoint, they moved away from this direction. They started converting all of these damage bonuses into ×4 surge bonuses, which, if you guys remember, that's 25%, and a lot of people, you have 3 surges on anyway, that's 22%. This is barely a difference. And so Bungie has changed their direction. They're steering the ship back towards non-surge exotic bonuses. And it's not an insignificant bonus either. It's not 10%, it's not 15. We're looking at 30%, and I believe this should say 20%. Sorry about that. That should say 20%. So pretty big, right? And it's not like it's extremely restricted in terms of what you can use. It's 2 whole elements and then a very popular element and then Lord of Wolves, which are like pretty broad categories, right? So despite the fact that, they are timer based and maybe a little bit difficult to upkeep, it's a change in the direction that Bungie is going with their philosophy, I guess. We also have this new sustained damage trigger, right? Sustained damage, especially weapon damage, wasn't really a trigger for a lot of exotic or even subclass based effects. And with this new patch, Bungie has instantly introduced not 1, not 2, but 3 of these sustained damage triggers, which is going to be interesting. I'm personally a fan of sustained damage triggers because they're good for boss damage, right? Usually timer-based stuff is more for neutral roam, traversal encounters. And for boss encounters, sustained damage trigger, I'm a big fan, right? So, getting your dodge back on speed loaders, keeping your sunspot up on Phoenix Cradle, or of course, Crest of Alpha Lupi, which is probably the most important of the 3 here, giving the heal pulse to your teammates when you do sustained damage. And we'll have to see what sustained damage means, if it means raw damage output, if it means like number of damage instances, like with wolf packs and stuff. We'll see what it means. If it's mag % based, which Bungie likes to do for a lot of their calculations, we'll see what it does. But again, another change in game philosophy. We did have stuff like Threat of Ascent, right? Sorry, not Threat of Ascent, Threat of Generation, and stuff like that, which was kind of based on sustained damage, and like Super Generation is also based on sustained damage. But never before have we really had it on like a exotic armor piece in this way, I guess. I guess Starfire kind of counts, but I'm gonna assume that there's no like internal cooldown in the way that Starfire has one. Okay, next up we have new fundamentals being introduced to the sandbox. We have Storm's Keep on Crest of Alpha Lupi. This is important, heals your teammates, nice, and you get your barricade back faster, which is also nice, just independent of your subclass. And then we also get Boots of the Assembler, which is potentially a 35% buff to your whole team all the time, if Boots of the Assembler works as well as they are saying it does, okay? So hopefully it targets stuff in the well, otherwise it's still probably not going to be very good. Maybe you could use it for neutral gameplay, but for the most part, it's not going to be used for damage if it doesn't target people that are in a well. Finally, new neutral options. I think these are the 4 to look at. We have Starfire Protocol, Prometheum Spur, Boots of the Assembler, and Actium Warrig. Boots of the Assembler is largely going to play the same way that it does right now, but it's going to have better uptime, and you get class ability back for having the Seekers hit your teammates. Prometheum Spur is a real question mark. I don't have much stock in Prometheum Spur. I do think stuff like Speaker Sight and Boots is going to be better. And then Starfire Protocol, again, 36% efficacy compared to pre-nerf, but you do have grenade chunks on kills, which you will get a lot of kills now, and your grenades do 65% more damage and have better passive regeneration as a result of the grenade curve changes. And finally, Actium Warrig on Choir, which is what I talked about kind of for a short time when we were going over the Titan exotics, but could be potentially a really good pairing to boost the damage of Choir, as well as increase your ammo gen, because Choir is excellent at getting many ad kills very, very quickly. Okay, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed. This was a fairly long video, but I hope you took away some important conclusions from it. We'll have to see some of this stuff like, well targeting for Boots of the Assembler and, stuff like grapple damage, counting the grenade stat and verities and stuff like that. Or maybe Bungie's going to change grenades to additive as well. Who knows? We'll see. But for now, I'll catch you guys later. Thanks for watching. This has been a pretty long one, but this is a pretty big change, and I hope you guys appreciated the video. Okay, I'll see you guys around. Goodbye.